Hello, you're watching Talk On, the podcast of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Germany. My name is Christoph Brumann.
And I'm Jovan Maud. And in this podcast, we're going to be talking about current research and debates in the field of social anthropology. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that concerns pretty much everyone in the world, debt, how we understand it and how we manage it. And today, to discuss that topic, I'm joined by Marek Mikuš, who is a research leader. He's leading an Emmy Noether project with the title Peripheral Debt, Money, Risk and Politics in Eastern Europe. Welcome, Marek.
Hi.
Hi. So the main topic that we want to talk about today is going to be an article that you're just about to publish in the journal Current Anthropology. And its title is Tracking Mortgage Pathways in Zaghreb, Everyday Economics of Debt, Housing, Wealth and Debtors Agency in a European Semi-Periphery. Okay, now that's quite a mouthful. There's a lot to unpack there. And that's, of course, what we'll be doing in this conversation. But first, maybe if we can just zoom out a little bit and ask you about this Emmy Noether project that you're working on. So what is the main focus and what is this concept of peripheral debt that you're working with?
Right. So Peripheral Debt is a research group that studies household debt, which is a kind of technical name for borrowing and lending to individuals and households in 4 Eastern European countries, Croatia, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. Mm-hmm. And so basically we're looking at household debt in a variety of forms and from a variety of angles, but as the title of this group suggests, our starting analytical foci have been on the forms and roles of money in household debt, various risks that are inherent to household debt and how people manage them, and then finally politics and policies around household debt. As for peripheral in the title of the group, this refers to a concept of peripheral financialization, which is also one of our inspirations. And just to explain, maybe first the concept of financialization in general. This is a concept for this process of increasing power and prominence of finance, financial sector, financial tools and assets, even financial logics and narratives in recent decades. And peripheral financialization is then a twist on this concept which seeks to describe specific forms of financialization in peripheries and semi-peripheries of the global economy, such as Eastern Europe. We hypothesize that we can see peripheral financialization in Eastern Europe, or at least historically we have seen it. And what we are trying to do as anthropologists is to take this concept developed by economists, so mainly concerned with the macroeconomy and kind of formal economic relations, and to instead see what it could mean at this level of kind of micro practices, everyday life, and specifically in the context of household debt. So that's the idea of the group in the nutshell.
Right. So yeah, I wanted to ask you about like how you're approaching this topic anthropologically. So seeing as you mentioned it, I may as well ask you now. So yeah, what kind of methods are you using in order to explore this question of household debt?
Well, it's the usual anthropological toolbox, a combination of field work, interviews, collection of archival data, kind of media data, documents, and so forth.
Okay, and what is it like you expect to be able to draw out of the research that you wouldn't find in an economic study?
Well, I mean, there is of course a whole literature on household debt in economics, but mostly it's focused on kind of what you can deduce from formal economic statistics. And in a way, there aren't real households, there aren't actual households. You have the aggregate household sector, and then you have an average household, or maybe households that are averages of different income groups in society, but there isn't really engagement with the practices and experiences of actual individuals and households. So this is the basic idea of how to approach household debt differently. And then, yes, also to attend to social relations that are part of household debt. So in economics, there is a tendency to see household debt as little more, or any debt as little more than a financial relation between the creditor and debtor with the defined principle, the course of repayment. It's also a part of a bank's portfolio, a part of national accounts of the economy. But there is a whole more that is missing, and we are trying to bring that out. This kind of everyday and social part of household debt, essentially.
Right. Okay. And this is something that you go into in the article.
Yes. In one specific context and case.
Yeah. So we'll get that to that as well. So it's I suppose in a broad sense trying to understand debt as a sort of a sociocultural kind of phenomenon. So you'd be bringing in questions of people's values or relationships with loved ones or these sorts of questions, right?
True, while also keeping in picture the economics of that, which is part of this article, to try to show how we could approach the economics of household debt anthropologically. That's also part of the argument.
Okay, all right. So the the article that you're focusing on, that we're focusing on today, is in Zaghreb, Croatia. So maybe if I just ask about the Croatian context first of all, like what makes this an interesting place to be studying debt at the moment?
So I mean, in multiple respects, it's quite representative of this wider Eastern European post-socialist case of household debt. So there have been housing loans in socialist Yugoslavia that Croatia was part of, but in general their penetration of the society was more limited than it is today, and these loans were extended at quite regulated and fixed terms. So in a way, they were more as a kind of scarce benefit that you could maybe get than a loan. It was a different logic. And what we see in the post-socialist period then is an emergence of a qualitatively new kind of household lending, which is market-based, profit-oriented, done mainly by foreign-owned banks, which took control of the banking sector. And it's on generally more variable and dynamic terms. So there is more risk. There is greater variety as well. And we also see a massive expansion of household debt in various forms. First big boom in Croatia in this period was in the 2000s, up to the global financial crisis. And this mortgage boom, specifically, it was boom of household debt, but also boom of mortgages, was also coupled with a big increase in housing prices, which is often the case that mortgage booms and housing booms go together. And then the global financial crisis came, and what followed was a period of kind of stagnation or even decline in mortgage debt. But what kind of became apparent was that a lot of this lending in the 2000s took place in quite predatory and risky forms, even though they were supposed to be mainstream prime mortgages. And the chief form this took was so-called Swiss franc mortgages. The way this worked was that the contract gave the value of the loan in the Swiss franc, but all the actual transactions took place in the Croatian currency according to current exchange rates. So the loan was paid to the debtor in the Croatian currency, and then the debtor had to repay again in the Croatian currency, but always there would be an installment defined in this plan of repayment in the Swiss franc, and every time calculated in the domestic currency according to current exchange rates. So what this meant was that the debtors were fully exposed to changes in exchange rate, and what happened after global financial crisis was that franc appreciated a lot, by about 50%, I believe, against the kuna, the Croatian currency, and people's installments soared, and also their outstanding principal soared. And the debtors created this quite dynamic movement, which started a long legal and political battle with the creditors, which is still not fully finished. There were government interventions, legal changes, and so forth. So as I said, for much of the 2000s, there was a kind of lull in lending, but more recently, there was again a mortgage boom, which was driven by very low interest rates, which wasn't the case before, and also a government program of subsidies for mortgagors. So basically the government kind of attracts people into mortgage indebtedness and subsidizes the repayment for first few years. Housing prices increase again, and now it's recognized as a very serious public issue in Croatia. It's believed that because of how apartments are unaffordable for local people, this contributes to this kind of big wave of out-migration that Croatia is experiencing. It's losing population actually quite rapidly.
Okay.
And so this is the situation at the moment, basically, of kind of the really most kind of predatory forms of lending are kind of regulated out of existence. But the issue remains with basically very large debts that people have to take in relation to their incomes to be able to afford housing.
Okay, right. And of course, in the article, you discuss some of those cases, the case studies. Okay, so, when in your article you say that you're making an intervention in the anthropology of household debt, you see there have been certain areas that have not been focused on in the past. So what is new and original about your approach to this question?
Right. So one of the arguments I'm making in this paper is that it seems, at least to me, that a lot of the existing anthropological literature on household debt has been not very interested in what I call everyday economics of debt. So not really household debt in the sense of these financial statistics, but more in the sense of what actual individuals experience economically because of their debts, how it impacts their financial situation, their household financial situation, their families, but also what they maybe try to do with the debts in terms of economic strategies, right? So I found that there has been typically more on all manner of other aspects of debts, like their morality, their political kind of nature, how they are embedded in social relations. And I think maybe this also has to do with how anthropologists wanted to push against this kind of dominant concept of household debt from mainstream economics, which is basically reduced to a financial relation, as I said. But I think it's not the only way in which we can think about the economics of that. And in this article, I try to bring out this kind of more practical kind of economics of debt as they matter, as they impact actual debtors. And this means looking, for example, at how the prices of the real estate of the actual mortgagors I worked with for the articles changed over the course of their mortgage repayment. And I was able to show that for a good part of the repayment, their apartments were likely worth less than what they bought at, because they bought at the high prices before global financial crisis. So in a way, they were trapped in their mortgages for some time. And I'm also looking at their economic decision making, so how they are thinking about the various properties of their mortgages, like interest rates, currency, principal, and what they try to do about that.
Right. Yeah. So, like as you described that there, that suggests a sort of a longitudinal approach to understanding what people are doing. So, I suppose this is this notion of mortgage trajectories that. I got that right, didn't I? Mortgage trajectories?
It's actually mortgage pathways.
Pathways. Oh, well. Okay.
But they are basically defined as a trajectory, so you could also just call it mortgage trajectory.
Yeah.
So indeed, these are just pathways of mortgage indebtedness of particular individuals and household as it unfolds over time. And it's inspired by a very similar idea of housing pathways, actually, which is a tracking of changes in a person's housing tenure, basically. So what I'm doing here is that I re-interviewed a group of mortgagors in Zaghreb. I first interviewed them in 2016 and 17, and the first interviews also had a kind of retrospective nature. So I tried to reconstruct their mortgage pathways up to that point, and then I re-interviewed these people in 2020 to see what was happening with their mortgages and their kind of assets in the meantime. With some of them, there were kind of more interactions in between, because we developed some kind of relationship, but at the very least there were these two repeat interviews. And I argue that the benefits of studying mortgages like this, rather than as the more common snapshot approach, when you re-interview a person just once or maybe follow them over some short period of time, is that you actually see mortgages as what they are, this kind of very long-term process, which is not always fully predictable, right? So like when you only talk with a person retrospectively, they will probably try to make sense of it all from their current vantage point, right? But this gives you a slightly more objective perspective, if you want, because you to some extent can also see what is really happening outside of the person's narration.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, I'd like to get into, a couple of those stories later on. But there are so many sort of aspects that your article opens up in relationship to people's subjectivity, into notions of rationality, notions of agency. There are lots of interesting questions that sort of emerge out of that. So, like on the subjectivity question, you talk about this notion, this concept of the financialization of subjectivity, and you push back a bit against that, don't you?
Yeah, but not fully. So basically, financialization of subjectivity is this idea in some financialization literature that what we can see as the result of this increasing availability, but also use of financial products, is that we become, or the users of these products become, increasingly calculative and kind of risk prone and profit maximizing. So basically people use these financial products in all kinds of ways to maximize their profits. They are happy to embrace risk. And importantly, they think about more and more in their life as just another financial investment, including home ownership, right?
Yeah.
So it's just another way to make financial profit. But then, I would say that, it's often this idea of financialization of subjectivities is often based on quite cherry-picked kind of cases where you actually can see people who are kind of becoming quite immersed in these kind of financial logics. But then some other studies which worked with actual mortgagors more closely, they came with a completely different conclusion. And these authors argue that what we can see instead of financialization of subjectivity is domestication of finance, as they call it, which basically means that people take mortgages which have some kind of inherent financial rationality to them. You can do things about their properties, such as to maximize your benefit and minimize your cost, right? But instead of doing that, these people domesticate the mortgages in their pre-existing rationalities and relationships, and these are not very financial. It's more about, wanting to have a family, wanting to get ahead in society. So it's basically the exact opposite of financialization of subjectivity. So what I thought emerged from my data was something in between. I didn't see either this kind of full financialization of subjectivity or full domestication of finance. And I found that the best way to think about the rationality of my mortgagors vis-a-vis their mortgages was this concept of prudent rationality, which was developed in economic anthropology in completely different context than finance. And economic anthropologists, such as Scott Cook, argue that you can see this quite regularly across all kinds of society. It's a form of rationality which is mainly motivated by kind of prudent regard for your welfare and for welfare of your family. So a kind of selfishness, if you want, which, however, has a strong rational element to it. There is definitely instrumental rationality, means-end rationality, including kind of narrowly economic or financial, but also more broadly. But then it's also influenced by all kinds of social norms, cultural models. So it's kind of heterogeneous in nature. It's typically not purely instrumental or economic, right? And it's also flexible because of, the social norms and cultural norms vary between different contexts. So we cannot fully predict what it will be like in any given context. And I think that the rationality of most of these mortgagors I worked with is very much like that. So there was a strong instrumental element, which most often took the form of arguing that mortgage home ownership was the way to provide better quality housing than renting, which is the only real alternative that you have in Croatia. And it was also a way to accumulate wealth, because you don't spend money as in renting, but at least part of the money accumulates in the form of your equity in your home, right?
Right.
And of course, if you go deeper into it, you can question just how much it makes sense economically, but the way it's intended is economically rational, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's superficial.
It's very common.
It's very common in all kinds of countries.
Yeah.
So this is why I argue that there is definitely this kind of economically rational element to it. But at the same time, it was very much about a very kind of common kind of way of justifying entering mortgage home ownership was I wanted to set up a family, so I finally needed a stable and good apartment for that.
Okay.
And it's a context in which renting is very unregulated. It's often quite expensive for what you get. So part of it is social, part of it is structural, right?
At one point, there was a comparison to Germany in the article. We were saying, well, if it was the situation in Germany, you can rent for 10, 20 years without anyone bothering you.
Yes, one of my informants said that.
Yeah. But as coming from Australia myself, I notice a huge difference where a lot of what you're discussing in terms of people's attitudes towards taking out mortgages and home ownership, and this notion that it's necessary to buy in order to, I don't know, keep afloat in the real estate market. It's very familiar to me. But this notion of the financialization of subjectivity is something that, thinking about it through the Australian context, I thought actually this seems to make a lot of sense, because my perception is a lot of people do take this more entrepreneurial sort of approach to how they see what is a home loan, what am I doing here, seeing it as this kind of investment, as a sort of a strategy. Yeah.
And I actually saw it in different ways in my material as well. So even though, as I said, for most mortgagors, it was about providing a home for oneself and one family, they still typically acted on their mortgages in economically rational ways. So if they had an opportunity to renegotiate a lower interest rate, refinance at better terms, they often did. And in a minority of cases, there were signs of this kind of entrepreneurial approach to mortgages. I interviewed a couple of people who took mortgages to buy additional property to rent out. So I call this leveraged landlordism. Or they maybe more spontaneously decided to start renting out their mortgage apartment when they could move with their partner, for example. So there was that as well. But I argue that with this sample of people, it wasn't the most common rationality that people kind of adopted. It was mostly this kind of prudent rationality of providing home, but also accumulating and kind of trying to minimize costs, but in a relatively passive way. You basically go with what you can do, under given conditions.
And in some of the case studies, you talk about this tendency for people to sort of muddle through.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah. So what is muddling through, and like, is there a particular rationality you're talking about there, or?
That's okay. So muddling through is one of these logics of mortgage pathways, which I also identify in the article, and this was the most common in my material, and I would say it's the default. And basically, it's this kind of orientation to your mortgage where you prioritize repayment to keep the property of your home. You don't want to be repossessed, and you accept even hardship at certain points, such as when the repayment becomes inflated for some reason or your income goes down, just to kind of keep in the loop, basically. And this is what I thought I could see with most people. As I said, it didn't mean they were fully passive about their mortgages. They took these kind of individual opportunities to improve their situation, but essentially it meant sticking with the mortgage, for the expected kind of period of repayment. And a kind of alternative to this was speeding up repayment, which was when people kind of very intentionally try to shorten their repayment with extra payments. So some people, a minority of cases, they took some extra effort to earn more money, or they sold something else they owned just to kind of shorten the repayment. And this was often a reaction to when they realized that their repayment can go up because of changes in interest rates or these exchange rates, and they became kind of anxious about the mortgage, and they just wanted to get out as soon as possible. Or because in Croatia these problems with mortgages were quite public, they just saw it in the media and they didn't want to risk this in their future. So again, it seems rational because you can actually save money by getting out as quick as possible, but there is also often kind of emotional or psychological element to it. You just want to have the peace of mind that, you will be left without a job, but the mortgage is still there, so you might even still lose your apartment.
Right.
Again, it's complex and kind of layered, I would say, these motivations of people.
Right. Okay. So just going into like the empirical aspects, I mean, is there one particular story you could tell me, like of one particular case study that really illustrates the kinds of issues that you've been talking about?
Yeah, well, maybe I can mention the case of Modling through, which I discuss in a bit more detail in this article, since I mentioned that it's particularly common. And this is a case of a couple which was in their early 30s in the time when they bought their apartment. They took out their mortgage, and it was very much close to the peak of this housing boom in the 2000s. So they bought at a very high price. They found an apartment in this kind of upmarket part of Zagreb, which they wanted to live in because it was close to parents of one of them. So there were these personal motivations as well. And in fact, it seemed like a good deal in the beginning because one of the couple was a researcher at a public research institute. And at the time, there was another program of government subsidies for mortgagers who were researchers. So a very targeted one. And she was supposed to have a better interest rate, much better than what the market rate was at the time for the first year of repayment, if I remember correctly. But in fact, she was pregnant at the time they took out the mortgage, so they also used another benefit the mortgage had, which was to kind of have a kind of break in repayment, a moratorium for a year. And when they started repaying, it reset already at the market rate. So it very quickly became at the market interest rate. And it also, so I think they took out this mortgage in 2007 or 8, so just before the global financial crisis. And what happened in Croatia was that banks also just hiked up interest rates on these mortgages even more than what kind of money market rates would require so that they keep their profits. And the way they could do this was that up until 2013, banks could legally have debtors sign agreements in which the debtors allow the bank to change the interest rate on the loan as it wanted. So basically there was some kind of generic formulation. The bank can change the interest rate based on its assessment of market conditions or something like that. So basically any way it wants. And this indeed happened to this couple because of that moratorium they had. And I think they had kind of 2 delays in making some payments. The bank increased their interest rate to a pretty high kind of level and kept it there for a long time. So basically after quite a few years of repayment, they still owed almost the same figure as in the beginning because so much was being paid in the interest.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, they are quite aware of their situation and the costs of their mortgage. And it has just created a lot of kind of frustration on their part. There was a period in which they have been suffering. They had to limit their consumption to the minimum so that they could keep up repayment. So this is very much the principle of modeling through, but they just didn't feel like they had any alternative. They said, well, potentially we could maybe start renting out this apartment and rent out a smaller apartment to save. But the apartment was already small for the 4 of them. They had 2 small children. And in the end, the difference they could get out of this was probably so small that it didn't really make sense. So they thought that the only thing they could do was really just to accept their conditions. And when conditions in the market improved, they renegotiated a lower interest rate, and there was definitely an improvement in the situation by the time of the second interview. So they did act on their mortgage, but only in the ways that the market essentially or the creditors permitted them. So I think this was a quite typical case of muddling through, only the duration of this situation in which they felt they are not even starting to get out of their debt was maybe even longer than with some other people. So it was a slightly more extreme case. It wasn't even a Swiss franc mortgage, it was a euro mortgage, but nevertheless, they felt like they have been particularly cheated in a way by the system.
Okay. But they still have persisting till today with the mortgage.
Yeah, and in the meantime, because of how interest rates went down in general, they were able to get a lower interest rate as well. The installment became smaller, so several years ago, their situation became kind of more bearable, but they still have a fairly long period to go. So it's really a kind of lifelong affair.
Who knows what the economy will do next?
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe to wrap up, can I ask you where the research is taking you now? So out of what you've done now, what's the outlook? What are the open questions that still need to be answered?
Okay, so our research group has a little more than a year to go at the moment, and the three of us are working on our monographs. We're also organizing a conference on household debt here at the Institute in December 2024, which we hope will result in some kind of joint publication. So what I want to do in my monograph specifically is to look more at the case of Slovakia, which I haven't published on so far, or just very little, because I have done fieldwork there much more recently, and to compare it with Croatia. So in many ways, there are very comparable cases when it comes to this kind of post-socialist household debt, expansion and financialization, but even then there are many differences. And I think that's a good opportunity to think beyond this framework of peripheral financialization and to ask what else is there that can explain the differences between these otherwise quite similar countries? Are these maybe the different legacies of how household lending worked under socialism, for example? And what about the most recent stages of this post-socialist development? Can this be still described as peripheral financialization? Because what I think we can see is that these practices become more like in kind of economies of the center, right? So to what extent is it still useful, right? So these are some of the questions that I want to look at. And then comparative questions with my doctoral students who are working on Hungary and Poland. We want to think more deeper about the kind of similarities and differences between these cases. And we want to do the same at the conference and in this edited collection that would hopefully have a kind of global outlook that would kind of engage with household debt beyond Eastern Europe.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, thank you very much for discussing your research with me today. It's been very interesting, and I think I've learned a lot about why I should never get a mortgage. Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.